Before Ethan could even pull the land title out of his pocket, he heard a cold declaration. Our rules here are simple. The new owner must sleep with all 5 of them. He was stunned, his hands frozen in his coat. After a 3-day journey through the harsh desert, he had thought that the reward would be a quiet roof. Instead, right on the wooden porch, 5 Apache female figures stood tall, their eyes piercing him like spears. The woman who had just spoken stood in the middle, tall, with a strong face, her black eyes unwavering. Ethan immediately recognized her as the leader. The other 4 spread out, surrounding him like wolves hunting prey. He forced a smile, holding up the paper with the red seal of the government. I have legal papers. This farm is mine now. The leader, Ahioka, stepped down the steps. Her shadow obscured the afternoon light. Her voice was even and dry. Papers mean nothing in a place where the law is only 3 days away. Here, there are only our laws. Ethan clenched his jaw, trying to keep his composure. I don't want trouble. I just want to live and work on the land I bought. A soft laugh rang out. The youngest girl, Dakota, tilted her head, her bright eyes blazing with rebellion. You thought you bought the land. Marcus sold you to us. The name Marcus made Ethan pause. The one who had hastily sold the land to him disappeared before he could ask for more details. He had arranged everything? Another, Nayli, folded her arms, her voice calm but sharp. Marcus promised to live with us, work, share, and belong to us. He broke his promise. You are the heir. Ethan shook his head, angry. No one has the right to force me into this. Tyanita, her long black hair flying, stepped closer to him, her breath hot on his face. No one has to force you. In this land, you either stay with us, or you don't survive. Ethan clenched the paper in his hand, feeling it as light as scrap paper. He looked around, 5 sets of eyes closing in, with no room for escape. Chinoa, who seemed the gentlest, spoke first, but her voice was more binding than any threat. We don't chase you away. On the contrary, we want to keep you, but in our own way. The air was thick, suffocating. Ethan realized that his quest for freedom had just turned into a trap, and it wasn't built with guns and bullets, but with 5 pairs of determined eyes, 5 unwavering wills. He swallowed, trying to put on a defiant air. But deep down, a cold truth rose. The law here wouldn't protect him. Only these 5 women remained, and the dark rule they had just laid down. Ethan still clutched the certificate, but Ahioka's eyes bore into him, forcing him to understand one undeniable thing. From this moment on, his life no longer belonged to him. The air in the wooden house was thick with the smell of fire and herbs. Ethan sat motionless on the rough wooden chair, his hands on his knees, his eyes fixed on the single door behind the 5 women. He had wanted to leave as soon as he entered, but the 5 had blocked his path, forcing him to sit down like a man on trial. Ahioka, the leader, stood with her arms crossed in front of him. In the flickering light of the oil lamp, her face was even more stern. She placed a frayed piece of paper on the table. Marcus Vance signed this, she said, her voice firm. Ethan looked down. The paper was old but legible. The words were in English, scribbled, and a faint seal. He scanned it. Agreement to cooperate, to share land, profits, and to be physically and financially attached. Blood rushed to his face. He looked up sharply. This is nonsense. An illegal agreement. No court will recognize this. Nayeli, the quiet girl, tapped her fingers on the table. You're right, but the court is 3 days away, and we're right in front of you. Dakota laughed, leaning back in his chair. Your papers are worthless here. This land is alive because of us. The irrigation water, the soil, the cattle, we built it all. Do you think you can own it just by showing a piece of paper? Ethan gritted his teeth. He wanted to shout that he had spent all his life savings to buy this land. But when he looked out the window, at the rows of corn, the ditches flowing steadily from the small stream, he was forced to admit, yes, they did it all. Tyanita moved closer, leaning on the back of the chair, her hair falling over Ethan's shoulders. Her hot breath fanned his neck. Marcus promised to be ours. He lied, then sold the land. His obligation is now yours. No, Ethan said hoarsely. I am not him. I owe you nothing. Ahioka growled. You're wrong. This isn't about gratitude. This is about the law. Our law. Chenoa spoke now. Her voice was gentle, but each word gripped Ethan tighter than a rope. You're alone, Ethan. You came here to find a new start, but this land never accepts a lonely person. You need us. More than you think. Ethan looked around. 5 pairs of eyes, 5 pressures, 5 unwavering wills. He felt like he was being backed into a corner, facing a pack of wolves. The certificate he held trembled in his hand, suddenly becoming ridiculously fragile. Marcus didn't just sell you the land, Nayeli said, her voice low as if she were concluding. He sold his duty, and that duty cannot be avoided. The silence was suffocating. Ethan knew. This was no longer a discussion. This was a verdict. He could resist, but resistance would only mean death out there, where the law would never reach. The wooden door creaked shut behind him. Ethan swallowed, his fingers loosening on the useless paper. In the burning eyes of the 5 women, he saw the only thing that awaited him. There was no turning back. Ethan looked up, meeting Dakota's half-smile. She whispered like the wind whistling through the cracks in the rocks. You will understand sooner or later. This is not a choice. This is fate. The cabin was silent as night fell. The desert wind blew through the cracks in the door, carrying a biting cold. Ethan sat on the rough bed in the empty room, his heart in turmoil. The land certificate hung in the pocket of his jacket on the chair, now looking like nothing more than a piece of scrap paper. He had thought this was a new beginning, a chance to start over, but in just one day, all hope had turned into a strange kind of prison. Footsteps echoed in the hallway. Heavy, solid. The door opened without knocking. It was Tyanita who entered. Her tall figure filled the doorway. The light from the oil lamp in her hand cast a sharp shadow on her face, her eyes glowing like hot coals. Ethan jumped up. What do you want? Tyanita put down the lamp and closed the door. A half-smile appeared, both challenging and dangerous. Do you still ask? Marcus promised. You inherit. Ethan took a step back, his back against the wall. I am not him. I owe you nothing. She moved closer, her steps firm. You have this land because of us. Without us, this would be a desert wasteland. You want to deny it? Fine. But denying it doesn't change the fact you are ours. Ethan reached for the gun beside the bed, but Tyanita was quick, blocking it. The strength of her arms stunned him, not just a threat, but an irresistible pressure. You can struggle, she said, her voice hoarse, but struggling will only make things worse. Ethan's eyes flashed with anger, but there was something else too, a fear and a strange, deep feeling. Tyanita leaned closer, her breath fanning against his neck. Tonight is mine. The nights after, there will be others. The small room was drowned out by the howling wind outside, and inside, Ethan realized he had lost control of the situation. He had thought he needed only force or paper to maintain his control. But tonight, he realized that true power lay not in guns or the law. It lay in the hands of the 5 Apache women who were making him part of their code. When the oil lamp went out, Ethan squeezed his eyes shut. In the darkness, Tyanita's deep laughter rang out, mingling with the desert wind. You will never be a free man again, Ethan Whitmore. Dawn broke, the first rays of sunlight tearing through the night and sweeping across the red mountains in the distance. Ethan opened his eyes, feeling as if he had just woken from a nightmare, but the warmth on his skin told him it was all real. The room was quiet. Tyanita was gone, but traces of her presence lingered like a ghost. He jumped up, grabbed his coat and gun. There was only one thought in his head. Get out of here. The farm was unnaturally quiet. The 4 remaining women were nowhere to be seen. Ethan led the horse out of the stable, tightening the reins. The sun was barely up, and the dusty road opened up before him. If he went quickly, he could reach the nearest town in 3 days. There were police, there was the law, there was someone to hear his cries for help. He urged his horse into a gallop. The sound of hooves echoed through the valley. His heart pounded, each beat a reminder that he was still a free man. But after only a mile, a figure appeared in front of them. The horse neighed, and Ethan reined in his horse. Standing tall in the middle of the road was Ioka, the leader, unarmed but as strong as a warrior. Where are you going? Her voice rang out, deep and steady as a drum. Ethan gritted his teeth. To a place where I can be protected. I am not your slave. Ioka did not move. Her eyes were fixed on him, examining his every move. You can go, but out here there is only desert, bandits, and enemies. Marcus tried. He could not survive without us. Do you think you will fare better? Ethan drew his gun, raised it, his hand shaking. Move, or I will. Before he could finish, another figure rushed down from the cliff. Ethan's horse neighed and reared. Dakota laughed arrogantly, threw a rope and wrapped it tightly around his wrist, pulling hard. The gun fell to the ground, firing a deafening bang. In a flash, Ethan was dragged down, tumbling into the sand. He struggled, but Dakota quickly pinned him down, his eyes blazing. You won't escape. Don't waste your strength. Ahioka moved closer, crouching down, her eyes cold as steel. We won't kill you, Ethan, but you must understand, this place doesn't accept betrayal. Once you step into this land, you belong to it, and to us. Ethan was panting, sweat pouring down his forehead. He looked around. All was red dirt, dust, and an endless horizon. There was no way to escape. Even if he passed them, this land would swallow him up. Takuta loosened the rope, letting him sit up. Her youthful smile was no longer mischievous, but cunning. You can hate us, but you won't leave. Because out here, there's no one else waiting for you. Ethan bowed his head, his hands clenched into fists of dirt. In that moment, he realized the terrifying truth. Freedom was no longer in his hands. Not because they were holding him back, but because this land itself had trapped him. Ahioka placed her hand on his shoulder, her voice low but firm. Stop resisting. You will stay, and then you will understand why our laws cannot be broken. Ethan woke up with a limp body. His arms still bore red marks from Dakota's rope from yesterday. In the wooden room, the morning light filtered through the cracks, casting bright streaks across the floor. He took a deep breath, knowing it was time to face a new day. A day he was no longer free, but also unable to escape. When he stepped outside, the blue sky stretched across the open fields. What stopped Ethan was not the beauty of nature, but the sight of 5 Apache women working like a well-coordinated machine. Ahioka carried heavy buckets of water from the stream, her muscular biceps tensing. Nayeli bent over to adjust the irrigation canal, her eyes focused like an engineer. Tyanita herded the cattle, her shouts resonating like orders. Chinoa busied herself in the vegetable garden, her deft hands tending each sprout. Dakota climbed onto the roof of the barn, fixing each rotten log with characteristic recklessness. Ethan stood there, stunned. This farm was not the wasteland he had imagined when he bought it. It had been transformed by their hands into a living, vibrant place. Ahioka turned around, her eyes stern. If you want to stay and live, then start working. No one eats for free here. Ethan wanted to protest, but then he clenched his fists and stepped forward. He helped Nayeli dig another irrigation ditch. She didn't say much, just nodded when he did it right, shook her head when he did it wrong. Gradually, Ethan felt the rhythm of the work. Tiring, but also a concentration that made his mind less heavy. By noon, sweat soaked his back. He sat down by the stream, took a sip of cool water. Chinoa appeared, handing him a piece of toasted corn. Her voice was gentle. You did well. This land needs strong hands. Ethan took it, silent. For a moment, his eyes caught her smile, not threatening, not disdainful, just a rare flicker of warmth. But the brief peace was quickly shattered when Tyanita stepped forward, her voice full of challenge. Don't think you can get away with just doing a few things. Your obligations are much more than that. The words made Ethan's heart clench. He knew she meant more than just the work in the fields. As the afternoon wore on, as the red sun drifted toward the mountains, they gathered in the big house. Nayeli spread the old agreement out on the table. She pointed to Marcus's scribbles. See? It's not just land. It's not just profits. There's a life and body bond clause. Ethan bit his lip. This is just Marcus's sick joke. I'm not signing it. Ahioka looked straight into his eyes, her voice heavy. Marcus promised and then betrayed. We will not allow you to do that. You will stay, work with us, and share our lives. It is not a choice. It is a law. Dakota laughed, a youthful but sinister laugh. And you know what? This law, we wrote it so that no one can escape. Ethan pushed his chair back, anger rising. But then he realized the five had formed a tight circle around him. Deep black eyes locked on him. In that moment, the anger turned into a strange feeling, both imprisoned and drawn. He wanted to deny it, but the truth was clear. He not only needed this land to live, but now he also needed them to survive. Ethan clenched his fists, his voice trembling but determined. If you want to make me part of your law, then let me read it all. Late afternoon. The sun sank behind the red mountains, darkness slowly engulfing the valley. Ethan and Nayeli were inspecting the water channel when the sound of horses' hooves echoed in the distance, getting closer and closer. They looked at each other, immediately understanding. These were no ordinary merchants. A moment later, 5 horsemen appeared at the wooden gate. Their long coats were covered in dust, pistols slung at their hips. The leader had a long scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, his eyes cold as knives. He didn't greet them, just threw a heavy cloth bag onto the ground, making a metallic clang. Old debt from Marcus Vance. Time to settle it. Ahyoka stepped out, calm but tension hidden in her eyes. Marcus is no longer here. He's gone. The scarred one smirked. We know. And we also know he sold this land to some fool. The seller's duty, now the buyer's duty. All eyes immediately turned to Ethan. He clenched his fists, his heart pounding. How much? His voice was low. The scarred man gave him a contemptuous look. 200 gold coins. A month. If not, he drew a finger across his neck, smiling faintly. The air was thick. Dakota spat lightly on the ground, his hand on the hilt of his dagger. Tayanita moved slightly, as if waiting for a command. Ethan swallowed hard. He knew that the amount was not small, but it was not completely impossible. However, it was not just about money. It was a threat. And if they yielded once, they would return forever. When the knights left, leaving a trail of dust behind them, the whole farm fell into a heavy silence. Inside the house, the oil lamp flickered, illuminating everyone's tense faces. Ethan placed his hands on the table, his voice firm. They don't just want money. They want to take this land. If we're not prepared, they'll come back with more guns. Ahyoka nodded slowly. We know. That's why Marcus ran away. He was weak. He betrayed. She paused, looking straight at Ethan. But you're different. You didn't run away when you had the chance. That means the sentence was unfinished, but all 5 women's eyes were on him. Ethan understood clearly. From this moment on, he was no longer just prey in their rules. He had become a forced ally. Dakota smiled half-heartedly. It seems like tonight, our rules have added a new clause. Fight together to the death. Ethan sat silently for a moment, then sighed. He looked at each face, each pair of eyes shining under the lights. No matter how different, no matter how opposed, they were now all forced into the same battle line. Okay, he said. If you want me to be part of this law, then I will fight with you. Outside, the howls of wolves echoed from the mountains, like a premonition of a storm to come. Ahyoka squeezed Ethan's hand, whispering, Good, because next time they come, it won't be just a threat. The next morning, Ethan woke to the sound of hammering. When he stepped out onto the porch, he saw Dakota climbing nimbly on the roof, hammering in new planks to reinforce it. In the yard, Tayanita herded the cattle into the pen, her arms as strong as pillars. Nayeli spread out hand-drawn maps on the table, calculating the direction of the water and the defensive lines. Chenoa knelt by the garden, her hands clutching the roots of trees, whispering as if talking to the earth, trying to calm herself in the face of danger. Ahyoka, the leader, stood in the middle, her eyes scanning everything, then stopping on Ethan. You will no longer be just doing farm work, she said. Now you fight with us. Ethan nodded, stepping forward. His hand tightened on the pistol that had long been used only for self-defense. Now, it was a weapon to protect everyone. The tension was palpable all day. Ethan and Tayanita built a higher wooden fence, turning the farm gate into a crude fortress. With each hammer blow, he could feel the woman's body's strength surging, and he could feel his own. Takada showed him how to set up wire traps and spike pits around the entrance to the valley. She instructed and teased, her mischievous smile making it difficult for Ethan to distinguish between danger and attraction. Nayeli took him to the storehouse, teaching him how to divide food, control water, and ensure survival even under siege. Her patience made him feel strangely at ease. Chinoa brought him a bowl of hot soup after a hard day's work. Her gentle smile, her eyes bright in the light of the oil lamp, made him feel like he had finally found a home, even if only for the coming storm. Darkness fell. 6 people sat around a wooden table, the flickering fire illuminating each face. The defense plan was clear, but anxiety still lingered in the air. Takeda broke the silence. If they come in larger numbers, we may not be able to hold out. Ethan placed his hands on the table, his voice resolute. Then we will fight to the last breath. But they will have to remember, this is not their land. Ahioka looked at him, the corners of her lips curling slightly. For the first time, there was no contempt in her eyes, but recognition. Now you are worthy of being called part of the law. No one said anything more. There was only the blazing fire, and a strange feeling crept into Ethan, a sense of connection, of belonging. He had come here to find freedom, but he had found strength in the bondage. The night deepened. In the silence, the distant sound of horse hooves echoed, like the beats of war drums. Ethan grabbed his gun, and all 5 women stood up immediately. Ahioka whispered, "They came sooner than we thought." The sound of hooves drew nearer, like hammer blows to the heart. Ethan and 5 Apache women stood in line in front of the wooden porch. In the darkness, dozens of flickering torches appeared, at least a dozen of them, guns at their hips, eyes flashing with cruelty. The scarred man, the leader, urged his horse forward. He laughed coldly. "I gave you a month. Today is only 10 days. But I have changed my mind. This land, and the women in it, belong to me." Ethan clenched his gun in his hand. He felt his blood boil, no longer from simple fear, but from a primal anger. Ahioka took a step forward, her voice as hard as steel. "If you want this land, you will have to step over our dead bodies." The scarred man laughed, waving his hand. The riders drew their guns in unison. In that brief moment, Ethan could hear his heartbeat, then pulled the trigger. The sound of a gun tore through the darkness. The flames cast shadows on the dust. One fell, rolling off his horse. A melee broke out. The battle raged across the farm. Takeda threw her knife like lightning, stabbing a man who was jumping over the fence in the shoulder. She laughed wildly, her eyes blazing. Tayanita swung her wooden stick and knocked 2 men down, her muscular body moving like a fighting buffalo. Nayeli stood behind the fence, aiming each shot precisely, her eyes cold, not wasting each bullet. Chinoa did not hold a gun, but threw kerosene at the enemy. The fire flared up, turning the ground in front of the gate into a sea of red bris. Ethan fought right next to Ahioka, gun in hand, knife in belt. He shot, he stabbed, sweat mixed with blood, his mind filled with only one thought: to survive with them. The smoke of the gun was acrid. The neighing of horses, the screams tore through the night. The bandits did not expect that this farm was prepared like a fortress. They panicked. Some turned around and ran. Some still rushed forward. The scarred man roared, pulled out his rifle, and aimed straight at Ethan. For a split second, Ethan felt death was near. But Ahioka rushed forward, pushing him aside. The explosion rang out. The bullet grazed her shoulder. Blood splattered her shirt red. "Ahioka!" Ethan shouted, his eyes bloodshot. He jumped up, raised his gun, and fired back. The scarred man was hit, fell off his saddle. His body hit the ground hard. The chaos lasted for a few more minutes, then gradually dissipated. The remaining survivors fled, leaving behind the smell of smoke, blood, and fire. The whole farm was filled with silence, interrupted by gasps. Ethan knelt down beside Ahioka, quickly using a towel to bandage the wound on her shoulder. She grimaced, but still looked straight at him, her eyes shining. "You hit him." Ethan nodded, his voice shaking. "They'll come back. There will be more of them next time." Ahioka pursed her lips, then took his hand. The calloused fingers were hot, and she held it so tightly that he could feel the strength and the trembling in them. "Then we'll be ready." Far away, in the darkness, the bandits' horns echoed. It wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. Smoke still hung in the air as the sound of enemy horses faded into the night. Ethan knelt beside Ahioka, his hand shaking as he held the bloody cloth to her shoulder. The light from the half-burned torches illuminated her strong face, pale from blood loss. "Don't sleep," Ethan whispered, His voice choked. You have to stay awake. Ahioka chuckled, though the corners of her lips were purple. I won't go down that easily. But you fought like one of us today. Ethan squeezed her hand. In that moment, all the resentment, all the suspicion, melted away. He was no longer a forced stranger. He was part of the circle, late at night. In the wooden room, Chinoa sat close to Ethan, her soft hand holding the cloth to Ioka's shoulder. The scent of herbs wafted in the air. Tyanita stood guard outside the door, her hand on the hilt of her axe. Dakota paced impatiently, while Nayeli sat counting the remaining bullets, her eyes tense but determined. You have to sleep, Chinoa said softly, placing her hand on Ethan's shoulder. You've been fighting all day, bleeding. If you fall, who will we rely on? Ethan looked at her, his eyes gentle in the storm. He didn't answer, just nodded. But instead of lying down, he sat next to Ahioka, his hand never leaving her strong one. As the fire in the fireplace died down, the air in the room became unfamiliar. Fear and pain gave way to a tense silence, like a string waiting to snap. Takuta was the one to break it. She leaned down close to Ethan's ear, whispering with a half-smile. You see? Once we bleed together, there's no turning back. You belong to us. Not just on the battlefield, but in bed. The words made Ethan's heart pound. He looked up, meeting Nayeli's eyes somber, but with a twinkle of anticipation. Tyanita stepped in, sweat still rolling down her forehead from her time outside the door, looking straight at him. Our law is not only bound by blood, but also by flesh. Chinoa took his hand, her voice gentle but firm. You chose to stay. Now you must be completely bound to us. Ethan choked. But when Ahioka, still weak, squeezed his hand again, her eyes blazing like the last remaining flame, he understood. This was no joke, no longer mere coercion. This was a binding ritual, a final confirmation that he was a part of them. The door closed. The flickering fire cast the shadows of 6 people against the wooden wall, huddled together amid the smell of blood, smoke, and heavy breathing. That night, fear and desire merged into one, forming invisible bonds that bound Ethan and the 5 Apache women, not just by law, but by the choices of their hearts. Outside, the wind howled through the canyon, carrying the distant sound of horns. The enemy had not disappeared, but in this room, the 6 of them had become one, and Ethan knew that, from that moment on, nothing could separate them. The morning after the night of blood and fire, the sunlight shone on the scorched fences, the dried bloodstains on the ground. The farm looked like a battlefield just finished. But instead of collapsing, 6 people stepped out, their eyes brighter than ever. Ethan led the way, his shoulders still bruised from the battle. But there was no fear in his eyes, only determination. He looked around. The 5 Apache women, each with a different strength, were no longer the ones forcing him to obey. They were family. The workday began. Tyanita rebuilt the wooden fence, each blow of her hammer echoing like a war drum. Dakota checked the traps around the valley, reinforced the iron spikes, laughing with glee at the thought of the enemy trapped. Nayeli rearranged the ammunition, calculating each round like a careful general. Chinoa tended to Ahioka's wounds with herbs, then whispered prayers to the heavens, asking the spirits of the ancestors to bless them. Ahioka, though her shoulder was still bandaged, still commanded, her eyes like arrows piercing straight into each person's heart. Ethan worked beside them, sawing, hammering wood, drawing water, herding cattle. Each movement was no longer isolated, but in harmony with the collective strength. As the sun loomed, they gathered around the long table. Ethan spread out a map of the valley, pointing to 3 possible directions of attack. They will come back, more numerous. We need to turn this place into a real fortress. Dakota raised an eyebrow. You're starting to sound like a leader. Ahioka smiled faintly, her eyes glancing quickly at Ethan. He's not replacing anyone. He's adding. From now on, the 6 of us are a circle. Ethan nodded, feeling the words engraved in his heart. At night, after a day of hard work, they gathered around the fire. There was no distance. The wounds were cleaned, the blood was dry, but the bond was even deeper. Chinoa sang an Apache song softly, her voice soft as the wind. Dakota put his hand on Ethan's shoulder, his eyes both mischievous and challenging. Tyanita leaned against the wall, sighing contentedly after fixing the entire row of cages. Nayeli rewrote the food book, but occasionally looked up at Ethan with a hard-to-hide gaze. Ahyoka sat still, the firelight reflecting in her stern eyes. Then suddenly, she placed her hand on the table, her voice low but firm. "Last night, you proved yourself to be one of us. But remember, the real test is still ahead. When they return, there will be more bloodshed." Ethan took that hand, squeezing it tightly. "Then we will bleed together and survive together." Far away in the valley, a new group of knights was gathering, double, even triple the number of the old ones. The scarred man, now with bandages covering his shoulders, sat on his horse, his eyes red with hatred. He spat on the ground. "This time, they will have no way out." The moon hung low, casting a cold light over the farm. Ethan and the 5 Apache women stood silently behind the newly erected wooden fence. No one said a word. Everyone heard. The sound of horses' hooves thundered like thunder. From the darkness, dozens of torches appeared. This time it was not a small group. At least 30 of them, fully armed cavalry, advanced like a flood. The leader was still the scarred man, the bandage on his shoulder stained with dried blood, his eyes red with hatred. "We burn this cesspool tonight," he roared, raising his gun and pointing it straight at the farm. The attack began. A series of shots rang out, bullets piercing the wood, scattering splinters. Ethan shouted, "Hold your position," and pulled the trigger, the first bullet taking down a torchbearer. Nayeli fired from the wooden watchtower, each shot as precise as a knife. Dakota rolled into the pit, pulling the trap. A scream rang out as the 2 horses fell into the pit of spikes. Tyanita stood in front of the gate, swinging her axe like a magic hammer, each blow sending a man down. Chinoa ran along the fence, throwing bottles of kerosene onto the ground. The fire flared up, turning the grassland into a red belt. Ahyoka, despite her bandaged shoulder, still held her gun and stood close to Ethan, her voice booming like thunder. "No one retreats." Smoke filled the air. The sound of panicked horses mixed with screams. But there were too many bandits. They circled around from behind, throwing iron hooks to climb the wall. One jumped into the yard, his knife gleaming, only to immediately receive a shot straight to the forehead from Ethan. However, the situation was still hanging by a thread. Ammo was running out. Dakota gasped, "We can't hold out much longer." Ethan gritted his teeth, his eyes darting around. Then he shouted, "Open the north side gate. Lead them into the narrow passage." The plan was reckless. Tyanita threw open the small north gate. A group of cavalrymen charged after her, shouting. They did not expect that inside, Dakota and Nayeli had buried explosives from the old warehouse. As they rushed in, Ethan pressed the trigger. The earth-shattering explosion tore through the night. Rocks flew, horses and bodies flew, blood stained the path. The force of the explosion made the remaining men stop, their eyes filled with panic. The scarred man roared, but fear had spread. They turned and ran, torches scattered across the valley. The sound of horses' hooves faded into the darkness. The farm fell silent again. The wind carried the smell of burning and blood. They had won, but the price was terrible. Tyanita had a long gash in her side. Dakota was limping from a bullet that had grazed his thigh. Ethan was exhausted, but his eyes were bright. They had done the impossible. Ahyoka stood tall, sweat and blood streaming down her face, but her voice was loud. "Tonight, we did not defend only the land. We defended ourselves. This is our home, and it will always be." Ethan looked at the 5 faces around him. Warriors, women who bound him by blood, by flesh, by survival. He was filled with an iron conviction. From now on, nothing could separate them. Far away in the darkness, the scarred man lay flat on the ground, gasping for breath. A strange man in a long coat stepped forward, looking down at him. A deep voice rang out, "You failed. Next time, I will do it myself." The fire in that valley finally faded, leaving behind not only the smell of smoke and iron but also the quiet truth of what had been built. 6 people who began as strangers, even adversaries, discovered through hardship that survival was not about land or contracts, but about trust, sacrifice, and choosing to belong to one another. Their story reminds us that strength is never measured by walls alone, but by the hands that hold fast together when the night is darkest. And if you think about it, Isn't that the same lesson life keeps teaching us, whether on a frontier farm a century ago or in the smaller battles of our everyday lives? When families, neighbors, or even unlikely companions commit to carrying each other's burdens, they create a kind of resilience that no storm, no betrayal, no enemy can easily break. For many listening tonight, especially those who have walked through decades of change, the heart of this tale may echo familiar rhythms. It is the rhythm of communities rising from hardship, of marriages surviving betrayal, of friendships forged in shared struggle. Some of us have known what it means to be tricked, or abandoned, or forced to start again on barren ground. And some of us have felt the strange grace of finding, at that very moment, a circle of people who refuse to let us fall. These 5 women and one weary rancher showed us that even when life feels like it's closing in, there is room to build something new if only we are brave enough to join hands and fight, not alone, but together. So, perhaps the true gift of this story lies not in its gunfire or its trials, but in its quiet reminder: belonging is always stronger than fear. Out on that farm, what seemed like the end became the beginning of a family born from fire. Take a moment, friend, to let that settle in. If this story has touched your heart, consider passing its warmth along. Share it, speak it, or simply hold it close. Sometimes, the best way we honor a story is by making sure it doesn't end with us.